Hello? Testing. Can you hear me? Does this work? Hey.
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes. Yes, I can.
Who's saying yes?
That's Lee.
Oh, hey, Lee.
How are you doing?
Good.
Andy's going to be, he was going to do it via Zoom. I think he's at the airport. He's going to
Recording
Italia.
in progress.
All right, well, the meeting is now in progress, right? So let's get things going. Are you going to start anything? Or just stare at No?
We're just going to make a note of who's here for the meeting,
Okay.
and you can go ahead and proceed, Chair.
Not a roll call, but just a note. Okay. Looks like everybody's here except Andy, and I think Andy's on Zoom.
No, he's not on Zoom yet.
He's not? Okay, well, he was going to be, but. All right, so guess we don't necessarily call it to order, but it's a work session. So, Ginger, I think you had some opening comments you wanted to make.
I do.
Would you turn your microphone on, please?
Good evening, Chairman and members of the Planning Commission. Tonight's presentation summarizes at a high level our in-depth review and proposed modifications to our development code.
I'm serious, Ginger. Would you turn your mic on?
It is on.
Oh.
They can hear me. It says it's on.
It's just not very loud.
See, I can hear you being projected, but I can't hear myself.
No, we can't hear you projecting.
Practically swallowing it.
Yeah.
Hello?
Ginger, you sound great on Zoom.
Okay. When I first started in radio, they said that you should eat the microphone, so get real close to it. Okay?
How is this?
I think that sounds much better.
Is that better?
Yes.
Tonight's presentation summarizes at a high level our in-depth review and proposed modifications of our development code. If you recall, this was an action item in our community work program, which is a critical component of the Next 10, the city's comprehensive plan. We believe that these proposed amendments reflect the changes in our community and align with the city's goals for growth and development. We started this process last October and since then have conducted public outreach consisting of numerous listening sessions, stakeholder meetings, and work sessions. On November 13th, we will conduct our Planning Commission public hearing, and then on December 5th, we will present to Mayor and City Council seeking approval of our final draft of the Development Code text amendments. Tonight, we have Christy Dodson from Code Studio to take you through the presentation virtually.
Hi, Christy.
Hi, good evening, Chair and Commissioners. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. Is there a way for that screen to be shared on Zoom so that I can see the slides everybody is seeing? If not, I can try to pull them up next to me.
Can you see him yet?
Not on the Zoom screen.
They're working on it. Is Lee on this? I saw his name at the bottom. Is he hanging out?
Yes, so Lee Einsweiler, also at Code Studio, is on the line. Oh, perfect. I can see the slides now.
Oh, good.
So I'm going to walk through the slides. I'm going to pause after each subject because there are a lot of buckets of information, and I'll pause for any questions or comments that you all may have. You may have to speak up, though, because I can sort of see you all in the room, but not well enough to be able to acknowledge anybody. So please stop me if you do have questions or comments, and we'll go from there. So as Ginger said, this is an overview of some of the proposed changes that we are looking at for the Comprehensive Development Code Review, and this really came out of the effort following the comprehensive plan. Next slide, please. First, I'm going to cover some pretty high-level changes that we're looking at for protected neighborhoods. These are really light touches, so nothing significant in protected neighborhoods, but there are a few key things that I want to point out. Next slide. The first is very straightforward. In the conservation district, we're just adding some building setbacks. There aren't any currently, so adding that. And then the second piece is for essentially the issue is folks that have existing houses with existing garages. Those garages weren't necessarily built to accommodate modern vehicles. And so in order to renovate those, people need to have a little bit of flexibility with enlarging that garage. So if you have an existing garage that has existed prior to 2005, we are proposing that that is allowed to encroach in the primary setback, so that's your front setback, a moderate amount. And that would require that only one of those garage doors, a single car garage door, would be able to be street facing, and any additional garage doors would need to be either side or rear facing. So it's adding a bit of flexibility for that that primary street setback to be encroached on with a garage. Any questions about that?
Yeah, so I guess my only question on this, so a lot of houses are built back quite a bit from the setback. This would allow, unless there's going to be some specificity and associated standards, this would allow potentially a garage to come forward quite a bit, right? I mean, let's say that my house was set back, I don't know, I think the front, what's the front, what is it?
Let's say 50
35 feet.
Yeah.
And, let's say my house was set back 60 feet, okay, and that's where my garage was. Could I then build out from that garage, up to the setback and extend that garage another 30 feet almost?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in order to get at that, we are essentially setting two standards. One is an amount that you can encroach in that front setback, and then also, for instances like you're describing, an amount that you can only extend in front of the front facade a certain amount.
Okay.
So it would essentially prevent someone from building a significant garage if their house is set further back than the setback line.
Is there any limit to height?
The height would be associated with the height of the district. So it would be the same, since the garage would be attached to the structure, it would just be the maximum height that's allowed for a primary structure in that district.
So I could potentially build a garage with 2 stories on top of it that really is a pretty massive building, right?
Christy, if you,
Yeah.
I'll answer that one.
Sure.
I would say that there will probably be conditions or special exceptions when these structures are built. If the garage is going to encroach, it's only going to be for the garage, not for a second story above a garage for living space.
Okay.
This is going to sound pretty silly, but how are you defining encroach? Because to me, it would basically mean this could go right into the street. Maybe that's a term that has a different meaning in the code world.
So based on what Christy was saying, the fundamental thing to understand is that typically you have the house, which is behind whatever the setback is, because that would had to have been for them to build the house legally. So you have the house, facade, the setback, and then whatever the setback is where the right-of-way begins. And then beyond that, you get into the street. So there should in no case be any sort of situation like what you suggested might be a problem where it could go into the street. In addition to the fact that that would just be demonstratively too far to actually accomplish, like Christy said, there's kind of a length from the facade and then a length into the setback max, and so they create kind of this zone, if you will.
Yeah, I think if those details are in there, which they're not here right now, but I think if those details are in there, it's fine. I mean, it covers it.
Will those details be presented at the open house?
Yes,
Yes,
and
so
Friday. Sorry. Go ahead, Christy.
Yeah, at the open house, there will be full copies of the code text. This is really high level, just conceptually what the changes are.
Okay.
And then we will have the full code text so that any of these issues that you all or anybody attending the open house wants to dig into specifically to read the code language, that'll be available.
And for the 10,000 people or so that are probably watching online, can you say when and where that meeting is? Matt, you want to? There's a lot of people that.
Yeah, it's a big announcement. So it will be on the third floor terrace, your favorite place in the entire building, Reed.
It is my favorite place.
That for you.
And when is that? November 20, not November, September 26th at
6 p.m., like everything else it seems like we do here.
6 p.m. All right, good.
Yep.
At the select? Okay.
Okay, I've got a question. So looking at, for example, this picture that you all have there, it looks like the room over the garage or whatever, and we were talking about height restrictions and that sort of thing. But how are we going to, or I guess, prevent people from building, unfinished area above their garage and then finishing it off, at a later time?
It's a good question. The main thing is when you come for a building permit, we're always looking for things like that. So
If they do, right?
Yeah, assuming they go by the law and get a building permit. If they don't, then that's a whole other issue.
Okay. All right, let's, for the sake of not being here all night, maybe we should move on to the next slide.
Yeah. Next slide, please.
Christy's got a life. Matt doesn't.
I'm going to talk about a couple other general updates, and just so you're aware, the headings for the second two bullets are flipped, so I'll talk through those in the order of the headings. So the first one, protected neighborhood transition wall. So that is when you have a protected neighborhood adjacent to a higher intensity district. Essentially, what staff has found is that there needs to be some flexibility for the director when there's significant topography differences in those two. So when that higher intensity district is lower from a topographical perspective than the protected neighborhood up above, there needs to be some flexibility in the type of barrier that's being required there, or if there's environmentally sensitive land, something like a creek, any sort of watershed like that. Fences and primary setbacks that are parallel with the street. So we are suggesting that masonry piers would only be required in those residential estate districts, so RE1 and RE2. And then grading setback mitigation zone. This one gets a bit technical, but essentially what that would allow is some amount of flexibility for folks that are doing any sort of construction in their rear yard in particular, and that would allow for some disturbance in that side yard to essentially get construction equipment from the front into the backyard. And that would require a mitigation, make sure that erosion and sediment control is taken care of during construction, as well as after construction is complete, that there's some sort of ground cover, sod, that would mitigate that area that's impacted. And the issue there really is that, folks their existing structure, house is too tight to the side yard setbacks. And so it makes it really challenging to get equipment into the back if they're doing any sort of addition in the backyard. So that is essentially giving the director a bit of flexibility to allow for a construction entrance. Any questions on those 3 points? I'll keep moving if not. We'll go to neighborhood scale uses. So this covers a pretty broad spectrum of things. Go to the next slide. Talk about some of the, so some of the district standards we're looking at changing, and this occurs in several of the districts, really anything that allows, any district that allows single unit attached. We are proposing that the lot area and lot width requirements associated with single unit attached, that those be reduced. And that really is, the goal is to try to incentivize this type of development. Single unit attached tends to be associated with home ownership, and so we want to make sure that the district requirements for that use are incentivizing that type of development pattern. So the lot area, I don't know that, I can't remember off the top of my head the existing standard, but it would be reduced to 800 square feet per unit, and then that lot width is being narrowed to 14 feet wide. And then a couple of use standards that we are adding. We'll dive into these in a bit more detail in the next couple slides. Would be neighborhood unit. That's sort of manor house is what we've been talking about. That sort of that middle scale housing type. Age restricted units. That's a new use type. Neighborhood eateries, neighborhood retails. Again, we'll dive into the details of that a bit more. And then another change that is technical, and I just want to highlight it for you all since you live in the technical world. We're moving accessory dwelling guest houses up into primary uses. So right now they live in accessory uses and they tend to kind of get buried down there and hard for folks to find. So we're just pulling that up to residential uses so that people understand that that can be associated with either a single unit detached or a single unit attached lot type. They can have that accessory dwelling guest house. So those standards will just live in a different place. Any questions so far?
I guess my only question on that one is, when we talk about what a household is for the dwelling unit, it's pretty well defined. And would a guest house be held to those same standards, or could a guest house be a totally separate entity that could be used for, I don't know, any number of uses? I don't want to specify ones. Or is it going to fall under the same regulations that the primary dwelling would have?
Ginger or Matt, do you want to answer that? Because it really is, that's an existing use that you currently allow. So how is that regulated today?
Yeah, part of the definition, if I remember correctly, that's in the standards requires that it be an accessory to a primary dwelling, principal dwelling.
So it would be held to the same standards?
In terms of
usage, because, okay.
Yeah, it's a dwelling unit.
Well, I understand it's a dwelling unit, but, when you talk
Are
about
you getting at whether or not it's going to be a rental unit?
Well, it could be, because, you talk about a household being, we define a household in there as, where did I write this down?
So currently, if it's a long-term rental, we allow it right now. You can
Yeah.
have an apartment in your home
Right.
if you wanted one, or you could have one over your garage, or you could have, say, a pool house that's living space, and if you want to rent it out, you can, long-term without any special permits. If you want to rent it out or any part of your home as a short-term rental, you, of course, have to go through that process and follow those rules for that.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
So well. My question, but I think Andrea has a question.
Just to clarify that, we have like the 4 unrelated can live in the house and all that. So if somebody has this garage over the garage, could they have 4 people living in there if there's 1 bedroom? If they'd follow the same standards as the house would follow.
I think that would be spread across the property. I
Okay.
don't think you're getting 4 in each. I think the property stands alone.
Yes, I would agree with that statement.
Okay.
So on the entire property, 4 unrelated people.
Including the guest house or whatever we
Yes.
might call that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Quite a while ago, we spent a bit of time on permeable and impermeable surfaces, and if I remember, there's a percent of the property, the land that has to be left open so that water can. Does this now move this particular the guest house into what would be considered I don't know the right term, but the the amount of space taken up by the house, and then does
So-
that change the percent of?
It would if you added on a guest house or if you added on a garage or anything like that. Yes, it would count towards your total for the entire lot, towards your impervious coverage. And you still follow the same rules. So if you have a 30% maximum lot coverage for that, then and it makes you go over, you can either do mitigation, or if it goes too far, you could possibly need a variance if they grant it.
Okay.
All right, Chrissy.
Thanks. We'll go on to the next slide. So let's talk about neighborhood unit. So this is what we're calling sort of a manor house. So it is generally of the scale of a single-family house, but it has different apartments within it, or different units. You know, these can be rental or ownership. There are a lot of historic examples that are sort of small-scale condos, for example. And we are proposing that this was a new use that we're proposing, that these buildings, that you would be allowed to have one building per lot, and an RU, you would be allowed up to 4 units in that building. An RT, RM, RX, ON, and OX, you could have 12 units in that single building. And there are specific standards associated with this to make sure that they are more of that neighborhood scale. So one of the ways that we do that is height. So the height would be limited to 2.5 stories. And if you are over 2 stories, so if you go into that 2.5 story range, then that roof has to be sloped. And then we're also limiting the width of the building, because that width really impacts sort of the bulk and feel of the building when you're standing on the sidewalk. And so we want to make sure that the width is associated with more of a house scale width. And then any garage or carport that would be associated with that building would have to be located in the rear yard. So it's making sure that this has a more pedestrian-friendly face on the front, sort of putting the people's face in the front. Any questions about that?
One question I have, do we have anything to say with how things are on the interior? So for these individual units, must they have their own bathrooms and their own kitchens and all that kind of stuff?
So they would be classified as dwelling units, which, you know, do have cooking and bathing facilities associated with those.
If you're trying to see whether or not it's going to be dorm-like, no, it's not. They're going to be individual, self-contained apartments or condos. It's not going to be like a rooming house. No. That's a different category of housing.
So I can't open a hostel now in this area
You could
unless
not.
they each have their own bathroom?
Each have their, it's a fully contained apartment, so it would have living space, bathroom, kitchen, bedrooms.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. We'll move on to the next slide. Age-restricted units. So this is just specifying essentially a separate type of multi-unit that is dedicated to age-restricted housing. And so the standard and the definition of that is based on the federal definition, and that has to be done because of fair housing compliance. And so that definition is that 80% of the units have to be occupied by someone 55 years or older. And that would be allowed in the RM, RX, ON, and OX districts. And we're going to talk about multi-unit standards a bit later on in a couple slides. Those multi-unit standards would apply to these age-restricted units. And one of those being that in the RM district, 10% of those units have to be either single unit attached or detached product. Any questions on that? Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So restaurant and neighborhood eatery, and then the next couple of uses that we're going to talk about, retail and neighborhood retail. These are sort of pairs that interact the same way with one another. So restaurant and retail are obviously general categories that you allow today as uses. So we are looking at allowing that use with some very specific standards. in some additional districts, as well as creating a new use that is essentially a much smaller scale of that same sort of type of use, but it's more neighborhood oriented. So for restaurant, we are proposing that now be allowed in RM, and that in the RM and RX district, that any commercial use, so this neighborhood use, this restaurant use, would be limited to 25% of the development. So it really maintains that that's a residential district, but a limited amount of that could be mixed use. That is a restaurant. No drive-throughs would be allowed to be associated with that in the RM and RX districts. Neighborhood eatery is it essentially would function similarly, so limit the size, limit the scale, and this is crafted for the ON district, and that would limit the footprint of that building, overall the entire building square footage to 3,000 square feet. So it's fairly small, meant to be sort of bistro-like, and also no drive-through associated with those uses. So it really is meant to be more neighborhood scale. Any questions about that?
This is for Matthew or Ginger. So where do you see these kinds of developments going in place? Where in the city would that fit?
Well, excuse me, for restaurants, of course, that's typical. The change there is just allowing them in the more residential district of RM, but a maximum amount. Excuse me. The neighborhood eatery is specified really for ON. Again, it's an area that is a pretty busy area of town, of course, on the southern portion of Roswell Road that sees the ON district. And so I think there's a need there for the ability to have eateries and small-scale retail while still trying to be sensitive to that area, that community, wanting to kind of keep things pretty low impact. So that's what we think we've achieved by proposing this, and that's where those would go. Those are really specific to office neighborhood.
But isn't this, just putting it out there, direct contradiction to what was encouraged not to occur when the different shopping centers were developed and like the Sprouts and that whole area around there, because Roswell Road is just so busy turning in and out of any of these smaller shops, that traffic, number one, and you're going to have people walking along Roswell Road.
Yeah, good point. I think that this encourages the types of development that would see people walking more and not driving as much. Okay. And I think that it would, I don't know exactly, I don't think I was here when a lot of that was being developed. I think it was a little bit before me. But I think what we're trying to do here with the smaller unit size and no drive-throughs is discourage folks from turning in and out, and kind of making it a loop, if you will, but rather turning in, staying a while, and then leaving, and then in addition to that, being able to, as you say, walk. We all know office is not as sustainable an industry as it once was, and if that's their main stay, we think it's even more vital to have these options. If you're a business owner, property owner, we think you should be able to have some amount of retail and restaurant on Highway 9 or Roswell Road in a fashion that would complement the district.
So if any of that were to happen, though, all those, that would still require that it come in front of some panel, or it would go to you guys with their proposal. In other words, this just doesn't give them carte blanche if they want to put in a 3,000 square foot neighborhood eatery, if this is approved, that they just go in and do it.
If it's 3,000, if it meets that standard, now what we would be on the lookout for is anything above that, anything that's trying to do a drive-through or anything that's trying to come in at 5,000. And so everybody has an idea, if they don't know, your typical Chick-fil-A is 5,000 square feet building. The drive-through is probably twice that. The Sonic over here, that's 1,500 square feet. So just kind of give you an idea of how big that would be. It's a pretty small restaurant, a pretty small retail.
I think it's important, and I'm sure you are both very well aware, that there'll be some response to that, because this is exactly what, at least that area around the Sprouts and all that, that's exactly what they were trying to stay away from. So.
Yeah, and certainly there's a certain amount of folks that would feel that way, and so we would just put it out there to see if it meets anyone else's needs that's in that same district.
And I think what's important is when you present this at open house, you present with all the positive pieces that will come from this, and the livelihood of Roswell Road and the less traffic patterns and all that kind of stuff, and maybe that can mitigate some of it. Because I've
Yeah.
already heard from a few people about they're doing exactly what we asked them not to do
No,
4 years
that's
ago, 5 years ago.
100% agree, and I think we have to look at those positives, because that's why we proposed them as we did, is because we think that they can be done in a smaller amount, less impactful amount, and still provide options for, again, the property owners on Roswell Road, and now that they maybe can't sell office as easily as they once could or lease it, but also, again, just to, if they really want a district, the identity, a lot of times you have some restaurants and you have somewhere to go shop and that sort of thing. It can't just be office buildings forever. So,
Thank you.
But on those two districts, so like when she talks about the Sprouts development, that's easy to look at 25% of. But some of these, if I remember correctly, some of these buildings are smaller buildings within RM and RX. Okay, they're standalone buildings. So how does that 25% of the development reflect that? If I have a smaller building in there, does that mean that only 25% of my building can be a restaurant?
yeah, it's incremental, and it also takes into account that we can't control everything, can't predict everything, but we can also hope that that allows for some incremental change or assistance in mixing up that use.
I mean, like if I had, like, let's say I had a small building there that was at the current time was, I don't know, a State Farm office, right?
Mhm.
Just a building. It was like a house that got converted or something of that sort. I wouldn't be able to convert that whole building into a restaurant.
Not in RX. And again, we try and take into account the bits and pieces that maybe other people might see in a wholesale way. We try and say, well, that's a residential character. What does that mean? It means you can't just put a big commercial building there anymore, even if it has the X on it, RX. But we do think RX is certainly suitable for a mix of uses with the X in
Right.
there.
Okay.
But we just want to limit that. So a lot of the other districts that are primarily commercial, we have a minimum that we're proposing. Very small minimum. It's usually like the street frontage percentage of that. But when you get into the ones that have the R in there, we try and take into account that's supposed to be primarily residential. But we recognize how having some small amounts of commercial can help folks not have to drive as much and have that walkability.
Yeah, because that's what I think as pushing back a little bit on what she said, I think one of the goals is to create the ability to create like Canton Street in Roswell or something like that,
Right.
where you've converted some of these things and you have walkable restaurants that are adjacent to neighborhoods,
Mhm.
where you don't have to get into a car and drive. And yeah, they might change the complexion of the neighborhood a little bit, but hopefully they change them for the better.
Yeah.
Because it becomes a neighborhood place where people go and have dinner and see their friends and do that. So
You think right outside here, I don't think there's probably a retail or restaurant outside in the campus here at City Hall. I don't think anything's probably over 3,000 square feet. I could be wrong, but does anybody have an issue with what's here? You know, in terms of its size, it's not. I mean, a lot of people probably have an issue with City Hall, but you know, not necessarily the restaurants, right? So, okay.
All right. Thank you. All right, Christy. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll move on to the next slide, which is very similarly structured set of uses. Yeah, flip to the next one. The one that's retail. There you go. Perfect. So very similarly, we're proposing that in RX that there is a limited amount of retail that would be allowed. So that would be up to 6,000 square feet. If it's standard retail, a little bit bigger for a grocer, so that would incentivize some grocery stores, hopefully smaller footprint ones, No drive-through would be allowed associated with that use. And then defining a new use category that would be allowed in RM, RX, ON, and OX, and that's neighborhood retail. So again, just like the previous use in RM, that would be limited to 25% of the development footprint. For that residential character with a mix of use sort of character that Matthew was just describing, and then it would also require that footprint be 3,000 square feet or smaller, and that there would be no drive-through allowed with that either. Any questions about that?
Just wanted, but the requirements for retail are the same as we have anywhere, like these little tiny adult shops and those kinds of things could not find a foothold in one of these little places, could they?
Those same requirements would be in place. So they would not be allowed in this new use, just as it's not allowed in your general retail use category.
Okay, thank you.
They're sort of separated out as their own. Yeah. Any other questions? If not, I'll move to the next piece. Development pattern updates. I want to highlight a few things on this. So cottage court is your current, that's the only development pattern that you have. We do want to add a bit of flexibility to that because it really hasn't been used that much. And we think that there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of those are just market driven, but we do think that by adding a bit of flexibility into those standards that it could help incentivize that development pattern to be used. So cottage court development pattern, we are proposing that it currently can be used by single unit detached and attached. We would like to add neighborhood unit to that list as well. So all three of those types could orient themselves around a court. In that cottage court fashion. And then we also want to add a development pattern that is quite similar to a cottage court, but we're calling it a shared court. And instead of fronting on a courtyard, it is a bit more of a shared street. So think of something that is, sort of a highly landscape design street that it has pavers, has some trees, and then you have these single unit attached, single unit detached, or neighborhood units fronting on more of a hardscaped court rather than a landscaped courtyard. So it's just a bit of a different typology, but a similar idea. And defining that shared court, that would be part of the new streets that will show up in Chapter 10 of the Development Code. So looking at adding a couple more. These are very pedestrian-oriented streets that, like I said, have pretty high hardscape design standards associated with those. Any questions about development patterns? I should highlight that these are just options for developers to use in certain districts, so that relationship to the base district will remain the same. Couple general standards. Let's go through those. This first slide really is a highlighting all of the specific changes that we are proposing for multi-unit. So first off, this proposal is for the removal of Section 663, which is the steel and concrete requirement. And so that would mean that any building would have to comply with all of the International Building Code requirements for construction materials. And in lieu of having that requirement in place, we have proposed a series of additional requirements for multi-unit developments. So I'm going to highlight a couple of those, and it gets a bit weedsy, so if you have any specific questions about districts, happy to dive into those. The first is that a conditional use permit would be required in CX, SX, and CS for any multi-unit development above 3 stories. So that would come before the boards and ultimately go to council. In addition to that, we are also proposing enhanced open space incentives. So really making sure that that open space has some amenities built in. I think this picture does a pretty good job of highlighting things like shaded space, nice landscaped areas, tables and chairs, things like that. And part of doing that is making sure that people can use open space to meet things like the build-to requirement and also those building width requirements, allowing open space as a way for people to essentially put in a courtyard, and that sort of counts as a building break. Another piece of that is in these districts that are more commercial mixed use, so CX, SX, TX, CS, IX, CC, and NEX, that those have a minimum requirement for commercial ready space. And so that would be based on the street frontage, so a certain percentage of that street frontage would be required to be retail ready. And really what that means is you have to have a bit more transparency on that portion adjacent to the street, and that floor has to be taller so that it is essentially built out ready for a commercial space to come in. Another specific requirement is that in the RM districts, if you're multi-unit, that 10% of those units have to be either single unit attached or single unit detached. So it is sort of forcing that mix of building types in the RM district. Any questions about that?
The only question I had would be, so this supersedes any previous zoning that was made in those districts for +3 stories. So I think of a couple. Allen Road, we had a 6-story building in there. The whole Jamestown development, I think of those. Those were approved by mayor and city council, I believe, but they were under the old rules. Do these new rules apply, or is that going to be part of the conditional use permit that they could be held to the standards under which they were approved?
So this would not affect them. They would just have to continue to develop according to the plan that they were approved for.
Well, but for example, they might have been, I guess they would have been at that point under concrete and steel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would assume that if I were one of those developers, I'd come back and go, hey, new rules. I don't, who knows what they want to do, but I'd come back and go, hey, it saves me a lot of money to go back to 2x4s.
I don't know that any of them were specified to build to concrete or steel. If they were, then that might be a little different. But if there was nothing in there about the building construction material, then they're held to the site plan and, whatever height limits and that sort of thing.
Well, yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
But they were under the 663, which did say, that concrete and steel or whatever the one is that says over 3 stories, it needs to be concrete and steel, correct?
If it's a condition of their rezoning or their whatever type of entitlement, then it applies to them. If it was just in the code, the code changes over time.
Okay.
All right.
All right, we'll keep moving. This is related to that multi-unit use. So in ON and OX, we are proposing that with some pretty specific limitations that there can be a conversion from office uses to residential uses. So in the ON district, what that would mean is any building that was used for a commercial use in the past 5 years, that could be converted to a multi-unit use, but that requires a conditional use permit, anything that wants to make that conversion. So they would have to go through the process of getting the conditional use permit. In OX, it's very similar, so that same requirement, it would have to be used by a commercial use for the past 5 years, and there would be an allowance for multi-unit on the 3rd floor and above by right. But if they were to propose a multi-unit on the 1st or 2nd floor, that would require a conditional use permit. Any questions about that? If not, we'll keep moving. So the next 2 slides are pretty intricately related. So I'm going to go through this one first, but know that the mechanism through which these new height districts would be implemented is through the second slide, which is the community benefits matrix. This is proposing some new height districts, and essentially what this is, these are new districts that just allow for height bonuses. And the mechanism in order to get that bonus is through a matrix that is essentially in trade for you as the developer are providing these sets of amenities, therefore you get your height bonus. And so the additional districts that we're proposing is RX. So right now is an RX3. There would be a 3/6. Commercial, you get CX 3/6 and then a 6/8. Some additional shopfront districts, 3/6 and a 6/10. And then in City Springs, a 6/8. And then if you'll flip to the next slide, we will, this is just a snapshot, by the way, of the community benefit matrix. Happy to provide that full list in the next day or two so that you can really dig into the details, but want to present this conceptually first. So any district that has a slash in it, even the existing ones, so in Perimeter Center, for example, there are a lot of districts that are something/something. And really this is just codifying a lot of the existing language that you have in, you have a bonus available, but doesn't really specify what a developer has to do in order to achieve that bonus. So this matrix is attempting to codify what has to be done in order to achieve the bonus. And so this applies for additional height, and it also applies in Perimeter Center where you have height minimums. So you can actually have a reduction in height if you do that in trade for some of these community benefits. And fundamentally what that does is you have the stories listed in the first column of the amount of stories you're trying to get up to. And then across the top, the percentage of the site that would receive that bonus. So you have to get more credits. You have to earn more credits if you want to build more of the site at the taller district height. And so this community benefits list is extensive. It's probably 4 or 5 pages long of all kinds of different benefits that a developer could choose to provide. And, these range from things like, this aesthetics and furnishings is a good example. Things like seat walls, masonry facade materials, pet way stations, murals, pavers, upgraded hardscape. There's a extensive list of essentially how you can achieve these credits in order to get that height bonus. Any questions about that sort of conceptual framework?
Is there anything in there? Is there any credit opportunity in there for like lower rents or, I don't know, for lack of a better term, affordable housing or any rent reduction?
Yeah, great question. There is a line in there for the provision of workforce housing, which is that sort of 80% of area median income reduced rent range. So there could be some credits for that. One thing I will point out is, this is something that is going to have to continue to be calibrated over time. A lot of the existing projects, like the Jamestown one, for example, that you referenced earlier, was used as a way to consider what credit should be offered for which amenities. But as the market changes, or as the priorities of what type of amenity or public benefit is most prioritized from a policy perspective, then the credits allocated to that will need to be evaluated at least annually to make sure that it is sort of right-sizing and incentivizing the right things, and that the credits are, that people are actually incentivized to use the bonus. I will point out that in relation to that, so I mentioned the minimum heights that exist in Perimeter Center. You have some other minimum heights throughout the code, but one thing that we are proposing is that in City Springs, that that minimum height requirement be removed, and then in Perimeter Center, where those other minimum heights exist, that those be reduced. And part of that is making sure that those minimum height requirements specifying that they don't apply to single unit attached or detached uses. So those uses, if you have a 5-acre site, we are saying that's limited to 50% of the site because, places like Perimeter Center, we do want to encourage that mix of uses. So they can be up to 50% of the site, and that these minimum height requirements don't apply. And we also are adding in exemptions for things like, we're kind of putting in quotes, jewel box style development. And that is really illustrated, I think, by this picture here where you have these smaller sort of high design buildings that are in the middle of the boulevard or in the middle of a plaza that really break up the scale a little bit and add some interest to the overall development. So we want to make sure that there is some flexibility for, sort of occasional jewel box buildings and building that into the allowances in those districts that have minimum height standards.
Yep. I think this is very good.
Great.
So if things were to happen and all of a sudden Perimeter Mall, just like Gwinnett Place Mall, is changed, and there's a decision it's sold to a developer and they want to put multifamily and they want to put all this in there, they can do that at with a variety of heights, potentially.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay.
And then this is a pretty high level point, but I just want to make sure that it's pointed out. A couple of new street types are being added, and these really are that shared street or festival street is, sometimes what they're called, but these are really streets that are pedestrian and micro mobility oriented, so things like bicycles, and have things like pavers and pretty high level of hardscape and landscaping and trees. And these are really meant to be for sort of internal to developments. Some of the street types that you have in City Springs, for example, I think illustrate this well, and just give folks a bit of a broader palette to provide streets that are more pedestrian, not even oriented. I mean, these are pedestrian specific street types. We'll keep moving. I do want to point out a couple different use modifications. These are a little bit all over the map, so we'll go to the next slide, highlight a couple things. The first is defining life science uses. So this really is in reaction to a lot of the biotech companies that are moving to Atlanta, at the Atlanta Metro, that is. And, knowing that a lot of these really technology companies also have sort of an accessory lab use associated with them. And so defining that on the use table gives you a way to track where they are and, allow them to make sure they're following proper protocol. There are 4 levels of biosafety labs that are defined at a federal level. And we're proposing that essentially the first 2 tiers of that, so the lowest and really no hazard versions of these could be allowed in some of your districts. So these would all have to be administratively approved. So they would go through a process with staff to make sure that they're complying with all the standards. And these would, the biosafety level 1, which is the really lowest no hazard, this is almost like high school chemistry lab level of lab equipment, pretty basic stuff. And that would be permitted in IX, CC, and Perimeter Center and some of your corridor and node districts. Biosafety level 2, that is very low hazard, so just a half step up. Basically, non-communicable diseases that aren't dangerous to humans. Think like DNA testing, kind of lab work, things like that. And that would be permitted in OX, CX, IX, CC, and Perimeter Center. Administrative approval.
Christy, the only thing I would suggest about this is that we provide a lot of information to the community when we have the open house, because of course whenever you hear the word biosafety, you just think of a lot of different things. And so I think it's going to be important to minimize what people are going to go off and think of on their own and just put it out there, what would be considered acceptable based on these life science uses.
It's a great point. A couple of slides about fuel stations. I'll go through both of these just so you understand the sort of spectrum of the changes that we're proposing, and then take any questions or comments you have. The first is just beefing up the design standards that we have associated with fuel stations, and so that goes into more specific canopy design requirements, screening requirements from the sidewalk and the street, the build-to requirement, so wanting to get that sort of retail store component more adjacent to the street and the pumps further away from the street, and making sure that there's enhanced pedestrian connections. Another piece of this is thinking about your existing stations and wanting to incentivize ways for them to come into compliance with the standards of your code. You know, a lot of them now are sort of existing non-conforming, and they're just sort of staying that way because they can. So one way that we're thinking about trying to incentivize those improvements to allow those to happen is to permit them to add some pumps. So they would be able to add up to 4 pumps. And so by pumps, we really mean 8 fueling spaces if you think of a pump having 2 sides. And if they are to do that, then they have to have some pretty significant renovations to come into compliance with the code. So that would include building and canopy facade renovations, making sure those vehicle and pedestrian access points are improved and brought into compliance, that screening is brought into compliance, and then also any signs on the building or any signs that are advertising for the establishment would have to be brought into compliance. If you'll go to the next slide, a couple more things on fuel stations. Yeah, one more forward. Perfect. The 1-for-1 replacement. So right now, where you have fuel stations, there's essentially a distance requirement. So if there's a fuel station, then you can't have another one for a certain distance. We're proposing that distance requirement be removed, and essentially what this would allow to happen is some of those older stations could potentially go away, and some newer, more modern stations that fit fully the new enhanced design standards would be able to then replace them. So one would have to go away, and existing would have to go away, and that new one would essentially be a relocation of that use. This could only happen if a conditional use permit is granted. So that would have to go through the full review of the boards and council in order to get approval for that new replacement. And all of those enhanced design standards would have to be met. Another piece of this is thinking about fuel pumps as accessory uses. So Costco's being the sort of poster child for this. A lot of grocery stores as well have these fuel pumps as an accessory. And so we are proposing that this also is a conditional use that would have to go through discretionary review, that an existing retail use that is over 35,000 square feet could be considered to have fuel pumps. They could have up to 8 pumps, so that's 16 fueling spaces, and there couldn't be any convenience sales or vending machines associated with that. So it kind of just has to be pumps in sort of an island by themselves. And of course, there are screening requirements for that, signage requirements. All of those design standards that are associated with fueling stations as a primary use would also be associated with fueling stations as an accessory use. Any questions about that?
So can you please explain to me what the reason is behind removing the half a mile? Because to me, when I read this, it sounds like, we can leave some of these gas stations, they don't need any more pumps. Their cash flow is sufficient with the pumps that they have. They're not going to add any value to it. A lot of these gas stations don't even own these pumps and these canopies. They're owned by the jobber. And then, this means that a half a mile away, somebody else could apply for, and then it would be left to the discretion of our permitting and everything else that applies?
Kind of, excuse me again, kind of two
Matthew,
issues.
can
Yeah,
I
go
jump
ahead, Lee.
in?
Yeah.
This is Lee. I'm just going to say that the market is not operating freely in Sandy Springs because of the distance spacing. Everybody wants, the gas station right outside the entrance to their development, et cetera. So some of these what the mayor and council have called substandard stations are continuing to exist solely because of our having locked in the total number of stations. The marketplace would typically have made it impossible for some of these places to survive. And that's really what we're talking about when we remove that distance requirement, is a little more free play in the marketplace, but subject to stringent design standards and a review that means there's a public conversation about where these are located. I think one of the other things we have to remind ourselves of is that Roswell Road may start getting medians in more places, and that's going to make some of the existing sites unpalatable anymore because of their access. We don't want to create access problems along Roswell Road any more than we already have. So it's those two things in combination that I think we're thinking about. And Matthew, sorry for jumping in on that. There might be more to the story as well.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I was just going to add that I think that your original question had, in addition to what he said, had two separate issues. One was there's the distance requirement, which really affects more than anything the individual operators, the C-stores, your typical gas station. And then the expansion of up to 8 pumps, that is for your big box, largely the ones that are existing, or if they happen to be in a district that allows for it. But that would also go through a cup as far as I know, or it may be permitted. I'm not sure what we put in there because I don't know if we've really even thought of it in that regard. But the main thing is that the 8 pumps, you're only going to see that in a big box scenario. The other one allows for expansion of up to 4. And then let's say one of the larger gas station fuel stations comes before council for a cup and everything works out right, the amount of pumps, I believe, would be determined at that meeting. So these are for either the existing C-stores or the accessory use to a big box. Those are two separate things, though. And then the distance requirement really only changes things, for the most part, for the more typical C-stores or gas stations, fuel stations.
And remember that we only allow them in 3 zoning districts. So it's CC, IX, and CX.
Okay, but we're counting on, based on what Lee has said, we're sort of hoping that the older gas stations will go away when the newer, more modern gas stations approach us to come into those areas.
They will. They will have to. They have to remove one in order to get, right, don't they?
No,
That's right.
No, that's correct. It's a 1-for-1, so there's no net increase.
Yes, sorry, that part is
several
still
layers there.
here. That part is still here. They still have to buy one out. It's just when they go looking for the site to put the new one at, they're not constrained to either use the existing site again, or they're free to look for any site within the corridor that they think makes sense.
So there's a particular property on Roswell Road, and there's a gas station across from that property. So the person that owns that that vacant property could approach the guy with the gas station that's old, say, I want to buy your gas station, buy it, and then not necessarily have to build on that, but build instead on their empty property. Is that correct?
That's
Yes,
correct.
He
But
has to clean up the existing site back to being, ready for commercial property use.
they would also, if it's the site that I'm thinking of, assuming, they would have to go through all 3 layers, if you will. They would have to go through character area map amendment, rezoning, and then CUP. So that's by no means opening the door easily for anyone.
Okay, it does open the door, but there are some opportunities for input from the community and obviously from staff.
Yeah, ample opportunity for sure,
okay.
as much as there can be.
Okay.
I have a question. So how it is now with the half-mile rule, in our area, the south end of Roswell Road, there's been a big fear level of race or somebody coming in at Windsor and Roswell Road, which is just over the Atlanta line. With the current way that it's set up with a half-mile rule, does it count if one is within a half mile going into the city of Atlanta or not?
Yes.
Okay, so if we got rid of that, then that could continue to be a big threat for that corner there. That was just sold.
It would change that. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
All right, we'll keep moving. Vehicle showrooms, I do want to touch on this as a new use, and really this is a spin on a retail use. Tesla kind of being the poster child, where they essentially are kind of an Apple store, except they have a couple cars on the showroom floor. And so we are proposing that this would be allowed in OX, some of the corridor node districts, as well as perimeter center. And there's some really specific requirements around this. It essentially has to function like a retail space. So any display of vehicles has to be indoors. So there could be no vehicle display outdoors, no outdoor storage, no vehicle repair or maintenance use to be allowed to be associated with this, and they are limited in size to 5,000 square feet. So this is quite a small footprint for that space. Any comments on that?
Just it seems kind of random. I mean, I get that a lot of these changes are because of challenges that people have faced, and I don't know if this is a challenge that retail faces, and they're like, geez, can we put anybody in our stores because we've got all this rentable space that nobody comes in, but I don't know, it just seems strange that do we really need more vehicle showrooms?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Reed, and I would say that it is what you said to some degree of, changing economy, and sometimes retail's tough. Maybe this is a really solid way to lease out a space, but not to lease it in some way that's undesirable. It's also a part of changing technology. I mean, things are very different in very many ways nowadays, and so the changing tech's not just affecting office, but retail. You can now go into a store and with the way technology works, convenience is pretty premium, and so if somebody wants to buy a car out of a retail spot, it makes a lot of sense these days, and they do it, and obviously in different places. So yeah, it's just, again, it's little tiny ways that are low impact, but they allow for the economy to have more options to thrive, and ultimately that helps everybody when you can do it in a low impact sort of way.
We can't have a Carvana here or whoever comes in their place. In other words, the height restrictions will still exist, correct? In these areas.
You're talking about, yeah.
So because they have like the tubes that go up, and the cars are
the
all.
The towers are going to be explicitly prohibited. They're pretty much prohibited now in terms of interpretation. But yeah, that is a statement that is in the proposal.
Okay.
All right, we'll move on to the final couple of subjects here. And these are accessory uses. The first is for EV chargers. We just want to set a definition for levels 1, 2, and 3 charging, and essentially set some parameters around the location of where these chargers can be located. If it's on a property that's adjacent to protected neighborhoods, how far it has to be from that common property line, making sure that there are some requirements around the screens. A lot of the EV chargers sell ad space, and so we want to make sure that that's limited. And then also just limiting the size of the equipment, and really it's to get at that extra signage that can be sold to make sure that it's not having any spillover impacts from, bright screens or anything like that. And setting some screening requirements against sidewalks and streets. And then another accessory use that we are proposing is permitting daycare in places of worship. And these daycares would have to be operated by the same operator as the place of worship. So they would have to be, it couldn't be a third party coming in and opening a daycare in a place of worship. Any questions about those?
No, I think on the EV chargers, I think this is good that we're addressing this. I don't know how much more detail you're going to provide, because I think that it's one that, obviously, this is a very large growth category. There's substantial federal funding and legislation that ties into this. I mean, the administration has put a lot of money behind this, and I think we want to make sure that we have some really solid standards for what these are going to be, because, you know, it appears that electric vehicles are going to be everywhere, and, you know, they're already, especially here in Sandy Springs, there's a lot of them, but they're going to be everywhere within the next 10 years. So I want to make sure that we're ahead of what we're doing as we, you know, I mean, futuristic vision is that we're replacing gas stations with these EV charging stations. So, you know, are we looking, you know, seriously down the road on that? Because I think that's an important element in terms of what we want. I think right now we've got them in a lot of retail spaces, which I think are good, because it encourages retail shopping, and, you know, somebody goes in and they charge their car for 20 minutes while they're in Trader Joe's or wherever it may be. But, you know, I think that we're going to be looking at maybe larger needs in the you know, 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now. So I want to make sure that we're you know, encompassing all that into our futuristic views.
Yeah.
I have a question about the daycare. I'm assuming this is whatever it would be, 9 to 5 or 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. during the week? Or is this where the little kids go so the parents can stay in church and not be interrupted?
This is more of a traditional daycare during working hours. So these accessory daycare uses would still have to adhere to all the standards that are in place for daycares that are primary use. So there are hours of operation associated with that. The staff would review things like queuing space for pickup and drop off, and as well as making sure that, you know, there are a lot of state regulations that look at things like the different amenities or the square footage that has to be allocated per child that's being served in the facility. So those uses would still have to adhere to all of those standards.
Some time ago, we reviewed a request by a church, a Unitarian church, to create a daycare program in a facility behind the church. And we basically didn't say no. We just said that's a whole other stage of your renovations and things that you're doing. And as far as I know, they never came back. And now they have a daycare center operated by an outside provider. And will they be grandfathered in? I mean, this is not fair to ask you this question, but
I may defer to Matt or Ginger on that.
If it appeared without our approval, we could open up a case and investigate and make sure that they get it up to our standards, as well as meeting all the requirements of the code. So it wouldn't necessarily be grandfathered in because we know that it shouldn't be there. So if you want to provide that information, we can look into it.
Another recommendation for the open house is if we could clarify, this sounds to me like, I love the EV chargers and everything that relates to them. However, it's another flat surface. So I want to make sure that whatever kind of advertising, that the regulations that we have now, the development code that we have now, will consistently apply to these boxes as it does to flat building surfaces and things like that.
So that happens to be one of my pet peeves. So, and a large part of why we wanted to try to regulate them, to try to keep them so that they're not these continually moving animated type signage with advertisements on them. So that is something that we're addressing in the code. It should be
You'll have
reflected
that-
in the draft.
Okay, so it'll be for the residents to see what your intent is.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any restrictions on all these EV charging, whatever they are, stations that are in private homes? Because I'm seeing those pop up all over the place.
I think the only thing that we have proposed for that, because they're largely exempt, is that
Okay.
they don't constitute a commercial operation. So whatever that means, and some of that's going to be aesthetics, but mostly that they're not. There's not a customer base coming in and out.
Is that everything, Christy?
I have a couple slides to just talk about the schedule so that you all are aware of it, and that will be it. So we are here today on having the work session with you all on Friday. So we are working furiously to make any last minute tweaks to the full code draft. So all of those details that we've been diving into, that will be available Friday online. The following Tuesday, the 26th, we'll have the public open house. And then in that intermittent period, we'll have time for collecting any comments and questions that the general public have. And then on November 13th, we'll have the public hearing with you all, and then it'll come before the mayor and city council on December 5th.
Great. Question. This is it, right? I mean, there's no additional items that are going to come up. This is the summation. There will be detail to these things, but for example, I know that a lot of this came from feedback that staff got from builders, developers, et cetera, and there's a few things in here that are a few things that aren't in here that I thought might be in, but we're done with this process in terms of items. There's no new items that are going to be coming in.
There's a lot of changes in the code, mostly technical or just little things that probably don't matter to anybody but staff because they're more or less clarifying or whatever. But there's other items that'll be substantial enough to be interesting, but probably not controversial. These were the ones that were most, and not that these were all controversial, but they're a little bit larger in scope and kind of new or trendy or whatever. So you'll definitely see some things in the draft and at the public open house.
Will there be anything regarding retaining walls? Because that's
Yes.
one that I hear a lot about.
Yes, there will. There are a significant number of small changes. What we gave you today was an overview of the bigger picture, more policy type questions that mayor and city council were interested in, so we gave them this overview.
Okay.
But all of these other changes we've been accumulating for probably the past 6 years of, working with the code and trying to figure out, well, we got to fix that. So there are a lot of little fixes in a lot of different places. There are inconsistencies that we've tried to fix in different places. I believe one of the changes to the retaining walls that you'll see in the draft, which is in, what section is that, 8?
9.
9. Grading and retaining walls are in the same section. That we're going to allow a larger wall so long as it's interior facing, and that really only affects the person building it, right? So if you kind of are down in a hill and you want to hold back the earth and it needs to be taller than 6 feet, there are circumstances where we will allow it to be larger without a variance. So little things like that. We didn't change anything having to do with the locations of the walls, whether they're in the setback or not in the setback. That was a little tweak that we thought was important. to help homeowners, especially when they're on these huge lots, and it's not going to affect anybody but them.
Right. Right.
Or
Okay.
even on the small lots where it's interior facing and it's only going to affect them. They're the ones that have to look at it every day.
Okay. All right, that's just because that few people had brought that up to me, and I just was wondering. Okay. Great. Chrissy, you got anything else, or?
That is all I had. I really appreciate you all's time and consideration of all these.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lee. Ginger, you got anything? Matt, anything you want to add?
It's great to see all of you.
After a while, right?
Mutual.
After a while. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next week, I would imagine, at the open house. Takers?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's your favorite room.
Okay. Well, then, I mean, it's not official, but I guess we're adjourned then. We don't need to. I think we've been discussing for the last.
No, this is part two.
Yeah, it is.
We already did that. We're not talking about football or anything?
Dave, do you have any discussion items you'd like to bring up?
Not really.
Okay, great.
Going to be like the mayor and have any staff reports?
I never want to be like the mayor. Ever. Tell Rusty I said that.
He knows.
It's on record.
It's a mutual, I think, feeling. I think it's a two-way street.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank God, I was afraid we had to talk about it.
Congratulations on getting this far. Most of it makes total sense. You must talk about this at night. This must be your dinner conversation.
Recording stopped.